She was the daughter of Alberto Vasconcelos, one of the most powerful and influential businessmen in the country. From the beginning, Bea had chosen to live modestly, hiding her identity to ensure that Renato's love for her was genuine. Now, watching the man she once adored slip further into deception, Bea realized the time for silence was over. Bea sat by the window, watching rain trickle down the glass in thin, winding streams. The sky was gray, matching the quiet ache that had settled in her chest. Renato had left early that morning without so much as a kiss goodbye. His side of the bed had been cold when she woke up, and she wondered how long he had been pretending. It wasn't difficult to piece things together. The expensive cologne, the new shirts, the late nights, all pointed to one truth. Clara wasn't just a fleeting distraction. She was a presence growing bolder by the day. Bea first saw them together by accident. She had gone to Renato's office, hoping to surprise him for lunch. When she stepped out of the elevator, the sight hit her like a punch to the gut. Clara stood by his desk, leaning in as they laughed quietly. Renato's hand rested on her lower back, a touch that lingered far too long to be professional. He didn't see Bea at first. She stood frozen, gripping the handle of the lunchbox she had prepared. The pain twisted inside her, but she forced herself forward, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Renato looked up, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes widened in surprise. "Bea," he said, straightening. Clara stepped back with a polite smile, as if Bea were nothing more than a distant acquaintance. "I brought you lunch," Bea said, setting the box on his desk carefully as if it were fragile. She met Clara's gaze, calm but piercing. "You must be Clara." Clara extended her hand, poised and graceful. "It's lovely to meet you. Renato speaks so highly of you." Bea shook her hand, feeling the coldness beneath Clara's polished exterior. "I'm sure he does." Renato shifted uncomfortably. "Bea, I'll call you later, all right?" "This is important." "I know," Bea interrupted softly. She glanced at Clara once more before turning toward the elevator. "Enjoy the lunch." She left without waiting for a response. That night, Renato returned home late. The apartment was dark except for a single lamp by the sofa, where Bea sat waiting. The receipt for the bracelet rested on the coffee table, illuminated under the warm glow. Renato's eyes flicked to it, his expression unreadable. "You were at the office today," he said, loosening his tie. His voice was casual, but Bea caught the tension just beneath the surface. "I was." He walked to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. The ice clinked softly. "You didn't have to do that, Bea, dropping by like that." "I thought it would be nice to surprise my husband," she replied, watching him closely. "But I suppose I was the one who ended up surprised." Renato took a long sip, avoiding her gaze. "Clara is part of an important deal I'm working on. It's nothing personal." Bea's fingers curled tightly around the edge of the sofa. "You bought her a bracelet on our anniversary." Renato set the glass down a little too forcefully. The room fell into silence, thick and suffocating. "I'm building connections," he said eventually. "That's how business works, Bea. Clara's father is an executive at one of the biggest firms in the country. This could set me up for years to come." "At what cost?" Bea's voice was soft, but the sharpness in her eyes betrayed the calm exterior. Renato finally met her gaze. "I'm doing this for us, for our future. You just don't understand how things work in my world." Bea's heart ached, not just from the betrayal, but from the realization of how little Renato knew her. She had never told him about her family, about the wealth she had chosen to walk away from. She wanted to build a life with him, grounded in love and trust. But that trust was crumbling. The days that followed were quieter than usual. Renato continued his late nights, and Bea no longer waited for him by the window. She poured her energy into her paintings and the volunteer work she loved, yet the void inside her grew deeper. One afternoon, as Bea returned from the shelter, she spotted Clara outside their building. Dressed in heels and a sleek blazer, Clara's presence felt intrusive against the simplicity of the neighborhood. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, neither spoke. "I didn't expect to see you here," Clara said finally, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Bea stepped closer, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I live here. You, on the other hand, don't." Clara's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Renato invited me. We're heading to a dinner downtown." Bea's chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. How thoughtful of him. Clara's eyes flickered with curiosity, searching Bea's face for a reaction. Bea and Renato's love began like a fairy tale spun from humble threads. They were young, filled with hope, and convinced that nothing could shake the bond they shared. Renato would often weave dreams of a bright future, promising Bea that one day he'd be rich and she would live like a queen. Bea would laugh, brushing his hair back playfully. "I don't need wealth," she'd say. "I only need you." Their life together was simple but sweet. They lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, where the view from their tiny balcony was nothing but the rooftops of neighboring buildings and the distant hum of cars below. For Bea, the space felt like home, warm and filled with love. Every morning, Renato would leave early for work at a local firm while Bea packed his lunch with handwritten notes tucked inside, small reminders of her affection. Renato was driven, sometimes too driven. He worked late, often returning home after dark, exhausted but energized by the promise of promotions and higher pay. Bea admired his ambition, but feared that his desire for success would consume him. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she told him one night as they sat on the couch, watching the flicker of the television. Renato kissed her hand, but she could see the distant gleam in his eyes, the hunger for something more. Time passed, and Renato's efforts paid off. He climbed the ranks, earning recognition from his superiors. His clothes became sharper, and his conversations shifted toward business deals and corporate strategies. Bea noticed the changes but dismissed them as the natural evolution of their life together. She believed in Renato, trusted him. But things began to shift. Renato's absences grew longer, and when he was home, his attention was elsewhere. He started missing their weekly dinners, arriving with excuses about late meetings or networking events. Bea tried to understand, but the loneliness crept in like an unwelcome guest. One evening, Renato returned wearing an expensive cologne she didn't recognize. His shirt was crisp, and his hair was styled with meticulous care. Bea watched him from across the room, noting the unfamiliar air about him. "Big meeting today?" she asked casually, setting the table for dinner. Renato barely looked up. "Client event," he replied. "You wouldn't have enjoyed it." Bea forced a smile, swallowing the lump in her throat. Renato didn't meet her eyes when he said it. Weeks passed, and Bea began to notice patterns she couldn't ignore. Renato's phone buzzed late at night, and his laughter felt too intimate when he answered. One afternoon, while folding laundry, she found a receipt in Renato's coat pocket. It was for an expensive bracelet, purchased on the same day as their anniversary, but no such gift had been given to her. Bea stared at the receipt, the air thick around her. The name Clara had been scribbled on the bottom. At first she tried to dismiss it. Renato loved her, he always had. But doubts gnawed at her, whispering truths she wasn't ready to face. Hello guys, if you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us. The confirmation came not long after. Bea had gone to Renato's office to surprise him with lunch, something she hadn't done in months. As she approached his desk, she saw them, Renato and Clara, standing too close, his hand lingering on her arm. Clara was beautiful, sleek in a way that Bea never cared to be. The sight of them together felt like a dagger to the chest. Renato spotted her, his expression darkening as he gently stepped away from Clara. Bea didn't say a word. She placed the lunchbox on his desk and left without looking back. That evening, Renato came home late. The silence between them was suffocating. Bea sat on the edge of the bed, turning the bracelet receipt over in her hands. "Who is she?" Bea's voice trembled, breaking the stillness. Renato's eyes flickered with something, guilt perhaps, but it vanished quickly. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "She's the daughter of an executive. I've been networking with her. It's nothing serious." Bea's heart shattered with every word. "Networking?" she whispered. On our anniversary? Renato's gaze hardened. You wouldn't understand. This is how things work, Bea. I'm trying to build something for us. For us? Bea's voice broke. Or for yourself? He didn't answer. That night, Bea lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Renato slept beside her, as if nothing had happened. The weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest, and for the first time, she questioned the foundation of their love. Days turned into weeks. Bea kept up appearances, smiling when necessary, but the light within her dimmed. Renato, emboldened by her silence, grew more distant, treating her like an afterthought. But Bea wasn't weak. What Renato didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask, was that Bea came from wealth greater than he could imagine. When she found none, she stepped back gracefully. Renato is lucky, Clara said. Not every wife is as understanding as you. Bea watched her leave, feeling the weight of every word. That evening, when Renato returned, Bea didn't confront him. Instead, she greeted him with a quiet smile and kissed his cheek as if nothing had changed. She knew the game Clara was playing, but what neither Clara nor Renato realized was that Bea was already steps ahead. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. The storm was coming, and when it hit, Bea would make sure neither of them saw it coming. Bea sat at the kitchen table, stirring her tea long after it had gone cold. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Renato hadn't come home yet, and she didn't expect him to. His absences had become predictable, like the setting sun. At first she had waited, watching the clock tick past midnight, holding on to hope that he would walk through the door, kiss her softly, and apologize. But those moments never came. Now, she barely noticed the empty space beside her in bed. She told herself this was temporary, that Renato would grow tired of Clara's world and return to her. But deep down, Bea knew better. Renato wasn't just slipping away, he was running, and yet she remained silent. Every evening, Bea prepared dinner as if he might come home, setting 2 plates even when she knew she would eat alone. It wasn't naivety that kept her going through the motions. It was habit, perhaps even denial. She wasn't ready to let go of the life they had built, even if Renato already had. One morning, as Bea stood by the window watering her plants, she noticed Renato stepping out of a black sedan parked across the street. Clara followed closely behind, laughing as she linked her arm through his. They didn't see Bea watching from the window, their heads close together as they walked toward a cafe on the corner. Bea's hand tightened around the watering can, but she stayed where she was, unmoving. She could have stormed down the stairs, confronted them in front of everyone, but she didn't. Instead, she let them go. Bea turned back to her plants, gently brushing her fingers over the leaves. She whispered to them softly, as if the words were meant more for herself than the greenery. "Patience," she murmured. That evening, Renato returned home earlier than usual. Bea was painting in the living room, the canvas filled with deep reds and sharp strokes of black. He hovered by the door, watching her in silence before speaking. "Long day?" Renato's voice was light, as if nothing had changed between them. Bea didn't look up. "It was fine." Renato lingered, then crossed the room and kissed the top of her head. His touch felt foreign now, distant, almost rehearsed. "I might have to go out of town next weekend," he said casually, loosening his tie. "There's a company retreat I need to attend." Bea's brush paused for a moment before gliding back over the canvas. Of course. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. Renato leaned against the wall, watching her for a few moments longer. When he realized she wouldn't pry, he retreated to the bedroom. Bea remained by the easel, painting long into the night. Her silence wasn't forgiveness, it was observation. She let Renato believe he was in control, that his carefully woven lies were still intact, but Bea saw everything, and when the time was right, she would make sure he understood the weight of his choices. Bea sat across from her father in the private study of the Vasconcelos estate, the weight of the room pressing down on her like an unwelcome embrace. The leather-bound books, the mahogany furniture, the faint scent of cigar smoke. It was all so distant from the life she had chosen with Renato. Alberto Vasconcelos, a man whose presence could silence entire boardrooms, studied her carefully from behind his desk. His piercing gaze, inherited by Bea, softened only slightly as he leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "It's been too long since you've come here," Alberto said finally, his deep voice echoing off the walls. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten this place exists." Bea smiled faintly, folding her hands in her lap. "I haven't forgotten." "Then what brings you back?" he asked, though his eyes already held the answer. Bea hesitated. She hadn't told her father about Renato's affair, nor about the slow erosion of their marriage. Alberto had always been wary of Renato. Too ambitious, too eager to climb. "That boy will bleed you dry if you let him," he had once warned. Bea had dismissed it then, believing Renato's love would outweigh his hunger for success. Now, she wasn't so sure. "I wanted to see you," Bea replied softly. "I miss our talks." Alberto's brow lifted slightly, but he said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch between them. Bea could feel his unspoken questions hanging in the air. He rose from his chair and crossed the room, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey from the decanter by the window. As he handed one to Bea, his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual. "How long do you plan to let him make a fool of you?" Alberto asked bluntly, lowering himself into the chair beside her. Bea's fingers tightened around the glass. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Alberto's voice was calm but firm. "I taught you better than this. You are not a woman who stands in the shadows waiting to be discarded." Bea swallowed, the warmth of the whiskey burning down her throat. "I know." Her father leaned back, watching her closely. "Do you?" Bea exhaled slowly, setting the glass down on the table between them. She glanced around the room, the framed family photos, the awards lining the shelves. This was the world she had left behind for Renato, a world of power and expectation where weakness was not tolerated. "I wanted to believe in him," Bea admitted quietly. "I thought if I loved him enough, it would be enough." Alberto's expression softened, but his voice remained steady. "Love without respect is nothing more than a leash, and from where I'm sitting, that leash is tightening around your neck." The words struck deep, but Bea didn't flinch. Instead, she met her father's gaze head-on. "I'm not here for sympathy," she said firmly. "I came because I'm ready to do something about it." Alberto's eyes gleamed with a hint of pride, though he masked it well. "Good, because I've grown tired of waiting for you to realize your worth." Bea allowed herself a small smile. Despite his gruff exterior, she knew her father loved her fiercely. He had respected her decision to live modestly, but there was no denying he had been waiting for this moment, for the day Bea would reclaim her place in the Vasconcelos legacy. "I want to start attending the company events again," Bea said, straightening in her chair. "I want to remind Renato who I am." Alberto nodded approvingly. "You'll attend as my guest at the gala next week. Renato will be there, I'm sure." Bea's lips curved into a faint smirk. "He will." Her father studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing the newfound steel in her voice. Finally he rose, gesturing toward the window overlooking the sprawling estate. "This empire will be yours one day," Alberto said, his voice softening. "But don't wait until then to wield the power you already have." Bea followed his gaze, the weight of his words settling into her bones. For too long, she had let Renato dictate the terms of their relationship, believing that love meant sacrifice. But she was a Vasconcelos. Strength and resilience ran through her veins. As she left the estate that evening, Bea felt something shift within her. The game had begun, and this time she would be the one holding the cards. The night of the gala arrived, and Bea stood before the mirror, adjusting the diamond earrings that had once belonged to her mother. Her dress, a sleek midnight blue gown, hugged her frame effortlessly, the fabric shimmering under the soft light of the vanity. She hadn't worn anything like this in years. Simplicity had always been her preference, but tonight wasn't about blending in. Tonight, Bea would make sure no one forgot who she was. As she fastened the final clasp on her bracelet, a knock echoed through the room. Alberto appeared in the doorway, his eyes briefly flicking over her attire. A rare smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You look like your mother," he said softly. Bea smiled back, stepping forward to kiss his cheek. Let's make sure Renato notices. The Vasconcelos family name carried weight, and as they arrived at the hotel hosting the gala, heads turned. Bea felt the shift immediately, the subtle glances, the quiet murmurs of recognition. She walked beside her father, head held high, exuding the quiet confidence she had almost forgotten she possessed. Renato was already there, standing near the bar with Clara by his side. Bea caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes as he saw her enter, though he quickly masked it with a charming smile. Clara's expression hardened, but she kept her arm looped through Renato's, feigning indifference. "Bea," Renato greeted, stepping forward as if nothing had happened. "You didn't mention you'd be coming." Bea's gaze drifted to Clara for a brief second before returning to him. "I didn't think I needed to inform my husband of my plans." Alberto's presence beside her added weight to the conversation. Renato's usual bravado faltered under the older man's stare. "Alberto," Renato said, nodding respectfully. "Renato." Alberto's tone was polite but distant, offering no warmth. His eyes flicked to Clara, who suddenly seemed far less confident than usual. "I'm sure you two have a lot to discuss," Bea said, her voice smooth, "but I won't keep you. I'm sure Clara has much to share with the guests tonight." Clara's grip on Renato's arm visibly tightened. Bea turned gracefully, walking toward the center of the ballroom, where executives mingled beneath the soft glow of chandeliers. Her presence drew subtle attention, and she allowed it. Let them wonder. Let them remember. Later in the evening, as the speeches began, Bea quietly approached one of the organizers. A brief exchange, a knowing glance, and soon after, the microphone was handed to her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bea's voice filled the room, silencing the gentle hum of conversations. All eyes turned toward her. Renato's expression shifted instantly, his posture stiffening, Clara's hand still resting on his sleeve. Bea smiled. "It's an honor to stand before you tonight. Many of you know me simply as Bea, Renato's wife, but I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself properly." The room stilled. "I am Bea Vasconcelos, daughter of Alberto Vasconcelos. My family has long been involved in shaping industries across the country. Tonight, I'm proud to stand here not just as a guest, but as someone deeply connected to the future of this company." Renato's face paled visibly. Clara shifted beside him, eyes narrowing as whispers rippled through the crowd. "I've always believed in building relationships based on trust and respect," Bea continued, her eyes finding Renato's across the room. "But sometimes we are reminded that not everyone shares those values." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I have every confidence in the leadership of this company moving forward," she said, raising her glass in a subtle toast, "and I look forward to contributing more directly in the future." The applause that followed was polite, but the undercurrent of curiosity was undeniable. Bea descended the stage, her expression calm and poised. As she passed Renato, she noticed his hand trembling slightly around his glass. "Bea," he said under his breath, his voice strained. "You never told me." "You never asked," she replied smoothly, brushing past him without another glance. Clara released Renato's arm the moment Bea disappeared into the crowd. The balance of power had shifted, and Renato felt it slipping through his fingers. Renato paced the length of their living room, his fingers tightening around the crystal glass in his hand. The amber liquid inside trembled with each step he took. It had been 2 days since the gala, and yet the weight of Bea's public revelation clung to him like a shadow. Bea sat calmly at the dining table, flipping through a magazine as if the world around her hadn't just shifted. She could feel Renato's eyes on her, but she refused to meet his gaze. The silence between them stretched, thick and unrelenting. "You planned this," Renato said finally, his voice low but sharp. Bea turned a page delicately. "Planned what?" He set the glass down on the table with more force than necessary, the echo lingering in the room. "Don't play dumb, Bea. The gala, you knew exactly what you were doing. You embarrassed me in front of everyone I work with." Bea lowered the magazine, tilting her head slightly as she met his glare. "I didn't embarrass you, Renato. You did that all by yourself." Renato's jaw tightened. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "No." Bea leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. I'm just done pretending. For a moment, Renato said nothing. His eyes burned into hers, searching for any trace of the woman who had once waited patiently for him to come home. But the Bea sitting across from him now was different, colder, stronger. She wasn't waiting anymore. I made a mistake, Renato said, softening his tone as he stepped closer. But I did it for us, Bea. You know how important this job is to me. Clara was just an opportunity. It didn't mean anything. Bea let out a soft, humorless laugh. An opportunity? Is that what you call cheating now? He knelt beside her, gently taking her hand. I know I hurt you, but I can fix this. We can fix this together. Bea stared at his hand wrapped around hers, feeling the familiar warmth of his touch. For a fleeting moment, she remembered the man she had fallen in love with, the one who made promises under starlit skies, who swore he would give her the world. But that man no longer existed. She pulled her hand away. I'm not interested in fixing something that's already broken. Renato's eyes darkened. He rose to his feet, shaking his head. You're being unreasonable. No, Renato. Bea's voice hardened. I'm being honest. He stood there for a long moment, his fists clenching at his sides, before he finally turned and left the apartment. Renato didn't disappear. Instead, he lingered on the outskirts of Bea's life, watching and waiting for the right moment to reinsert himself. He appeared at company events, flashing charming smiles and acting as if nothing had changed. To the outside world, they were still a married couple, polished and untouchable. But Bea knew better. One afternoon, she found him waiting outside the Vasconcelos headquarters. His car, sleek and polished, idled by the curb as he leaned casually against it. You can't just show up here, Bea said as she stepped toward him, arms crossed tightly. Renato smiled, unfazed. I came to take you to lunch. I'm busy. Come on, Bea. Renato opened the passenger door with a dramatic flourish. It's just lunch. Bea's eyes narrowed, but she slid into the car without another word. The restaurant Renato chose was elegant, one of the same high-end places he used to frequent with Clara. Bea sat across from him, silently daring him to say what he really wanted. I heard your father's expanding into new markets, Renato said as he swirled the wine in his glass. That must be exciting for you. Bea arched a brow. Why do I feel like you already know more than you're letting on? Renato leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Because I do, and I think there's an opportunity here for us to work together. You know I've always had a mind for business. Your father respects that. Bea set her glass down, fingers drumming softly against the table. Is this your attempt at getting back into his good graces? No. Renato's gaze held hers. It's my attempt at getting back into yours. For the briefest second, Bea almost admired his persistence. Almost. But she saw through the facade. Renato, she began, her voice steady, let me make something clear. Whatever this is, whatever you're trying to do, it won't work. Not this time. He leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth twitching into a faint smirk. We'll see. Days passed, and Renato's presence grew more frequent. He began showing up at family gatherings, speaking with Alberto as if nothing had happened. Bea watched from a distance, unsure of what her father thought of Renato's sudden reappearance. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, she found Alberto waiting for her by the elevators. Renato stopped by today, Alberto said casually, his eyes studying her. Bea's hand tightened around the strap of her purse. And he seems desperate to prove something. Alberto's tone was unreadable. But you already know that. I do. Alberto stepped closer, lowering his voice. Just remember, Bea. Desperate men are dangerous. Don't underestimate him. Bea nodded, the weight of her father's words settling in her chest. She wouldn't. Renato could play his games, but Bea was no longer the woman who waited quietly at home. She was ready for whatever came next. The first sign that Renato had crossed a line came in the form of a phone call. Bea was in her father's office, reviewing plans for the next expansion, when her assistant quietly entered and handed her the phone. It's Mr. Renato, she said, hesitating. He said it's urgent. Bea's eyes narrowed. She hadn't heard from Renato directly in days. He had kept his distance, appearing at events, smiling from across the room, but never confronting her outright. Until now. She took the phone with deliberate calm. "Renato." "Bea." His voice was strained, lower than usual. "I need to see you." Bea leaned back in her chair, watching the city lights flicker beyond the window. "I'm busy." "I know about the merger," Renato said quickly. "The one with the offshore accounts. Clara's father is involved, isn't he?" Bea's hand tightened around the receiver. "How do you know about that?" "I pay attention," Renato replied smoothly. "We should talk. In person." Bea's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "There's nothing to discuss." Renato chuckled softly on the other end of the line. "You might want to reconsider. I have information your father would find interesting. Let's not pretend I don't still know how to get under your skin." A cold chill swept over Bea. This wasn't the desperate, apologetic husband she had dealt with before. This was something darker, calculated, dangerous. She exhaled slowly. "Fine. Tomorrow morning. My office." Renato arrived early, waiting in the lobby long before the appointed time. Bea found him standing by the large glass windows overlooking the city, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. "You didn't have to come so early," Bea said as she entered, heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Renato turned, smiling faintly. "Old habits," she gestured for him to sit, keeping a measured distance between them. "Tell me what you know," Bea said, crossing her arms. Renato leaned back in the chair, his gaze lingering on the art that lined her office walls. "You've done well for yourself. I suppose I underestimated just how much you were willing to hide from me." Bea's eyes hardened. "I didn't hide anything. You never bothered to ask." Renato's smirk faded. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across the table. Bea opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the documents inside. Financial records. Transactions connected to Clara's father. Some legitimate, others carefully hidden offshore. Alberto's company was listed in several of them. "Where did you get this?" Bea's voice was sharp. Renato shrugged. Clara wasn't as discreet as she thought. She liked to talk when she drank. Bea set the folder down, closing it with a soft thud. "And what exactly do you want from me, Renato?" He met her gaze, leaning forward slightly. "I want back in, on everything, the business, the investments. And I want you to tell your father I'm the one who brought this to you." Bea's eyes narrowed. "You think blackmail will get you what you want?" Renato smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "I think you're smart enough to know that Clara's family could hurt your father's reputation, and I know you'd rather handle this quietly." Silence hung between them, heavy and charged. Finally, Bea rose from her chair, smoothing the front of her blazer. "I'll take this to my father, but don't mistake this for forgiveness, Renato. You're walking on thin ice." Renato stood, adjusting his tie with casual ease. "I'm just giving you options. That's what partners do, right?" Bea didn't respond. As Renato walked toward the door, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "You'll call me when you're ready to talk more, I know you will." Bea watched him leave, her chest tightening with unease. Later that evening, Bea sat across from Alberto in the family dining room, the folder resting on the table between them. He scanned the document silently, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but laced with steel. "This could be problematic," Alberto said, tapping one of the pages lightly. "Clara's father has connections in places we'd rather avoid." Bea nodded. "Renato thinks he can use this to his advantage." Alberto's gaze lifted to meet hers. "And do you?" "No," Bea replied firmly. "I won't let him manipulate his way back into my life." Alberto leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter carefully. "You've grown sharper, Bea. But Renato isn't the same man he was when you married him. He's desperate now. Desperate men take risks." "I can handle him," Bea said confidently. Alberto's eyes softened for a brief moment. "I know you can, but stay vigilant. Desperation breeds recklessness." Bea nodded, understanding the weight of her father's words. Renato had shown his hand, but she wasn't finished playing yet. The rain poured relentlessly against the glass windows of the Vasconcelos estate. Outside, the sky churned with dark clouds, mirroring the storm brewing within Bea's chest. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching as Renato's car pulled into the driveway below. He stepped out slowly, shaking off the water from his coat, and glanced up at the house. Even from this distance, Bea could see the smug confidence plastered across his face. Tonight would be the end of this. Alberto was out of town, giving her full control over what happened next. She had called Renato herself, insisting they meet at the estate. His eagerness to accept the invitation only confirmed what Bea already knew. Renato believed he still had power over her. He was wrong. Renato entered the house without knocking, his shoes leaving wet prints on the marble floor as he approached. Bea descended the staircase slowly, her heels clicking softly with each step. "You always did enjoy the dramatic," Renato said, smirking as he took in the luxurious surroundings. "I have to admit, it suits you." Bea's expression remained calm, unreadable. "I thought you deserved a proper goodbye." Renato chuckled, but the sound held no real amusement. "Goodbye? You're being a little premature, don't you think? I brought you something." He reached into his coat and pulled out another folder, holding it just out of her reach. "More leverage?" Bea asked dryly. "Consider it insurance," Renato replied. "I did some digging. Your father's company isn't as clean as you'd like to believe. There are deals here that, if exposed, could cause serious damage." Bea's gaze darkened, but she refused to take the bait. "And what do you want in return for your silence?" Renato stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I want everything I had before and more. You'll convince Alberto to let me back in. I'll have access to the accounts, to the projects, and you'll stay by my side, Bea. This doesn't have to be a fight. We can win together." Bea's heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained cold. "You're asking for far too much," she said quietly. Renato smirked, leaning closer until his lips were near her ear. "You don't have a choice." Bea's eyes flicked to the security cameras in the corner of the room. She had already thought 3 steps ahead. "I do," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always have." Before Renato could respond, the front door creaked open. 2 uniformed officers entered the house, their faces stern as they stepped toward the pair. Renato's confidence faltered. "What is this?" Bea stepped away from him, allowing the officers to close in. "You see, Renato, I made a call this morning. Those documents you're holding, they're forgeries. I planted them to see just how far you'd go." His grip on the folder tightened as the officers stood on either side of him. "You set me up." Bea's eyes met his, unwavering. "I warned you." Renato's face twisted with fury, his composure unraveling for the first time. "You can't do this. I know things, Bea. I can still destroy you." She stepped forward until their faces were inches apart. "No, Renato, you can't. Because after tonight, you'll be nothing but a memory." The officers escorted him toward the door, but Renato fought against their hold. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice echoing through the vast hall. "You'll regret this, Bea." She didn't flinch. As the door slammed shut behind them, Bea exhaled softly, the weight she had carried for months finally beginning to lift. The storm outside began to ease, the distant clouds parting to reveal the faintest glimmer of stars. Bea ascended the staircase once more, leaving behind the ghosts of a life she no longer needed. The days following Renato's arrest were quiet. Almost too quiet. Bea sat at her father's desk, sunlight streaming in through the large windows that overlooked the city skyline. The same view she had once dismissed now felt different, like a kingdom she had reclaimed. Papers lay neatly stacked in front of her, signatures marking the final phases of the Vasconcelos expansion project. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. It was a message from her father. "Proud of you. Let's discuss next steps when I return." Bea smiled faintly, setting the phone aside. For the first time in months, the silence felt peaceful, not suffocating. Her assistant stepped into the room, holding a folder. "Mrs. Vasconcelos, the board is ready for you." Mrs. Vasconcelos. The name settled over her like a crown. She had always carried it, but now it felt heavier, more meaningful. "Thank you, Clara. I'll be right there." Clara nodded and disappeared down the hall, leaving Bea to gather her thoughts. Renato's influence had evaporated. The board, once charmed by his ambitious promises, had distanced themselves almost overnight. Without Clara's connections or his manipulative schemes, Renato had nothing left to leverage. Bea had made sure of it. As she entered the boardroom, the room fell silent. Executives who once whispered behind her back now stood in acknowledgement, offering polite smiles and subtle nods. Alberto's seat at the head of the table was empty, but Bea took her place beside it, settling into the chair with quiet confidence. "Before we begin," she started, her voice calm but commanding, "I want to personally thank all of you for your trust during these transitions." A few murmurs of agreement followed. "I understand the concerns that may have arisen from recent events," Bea continued, "but let me assure you this company is stronger than ever. We are no longer vulnerable to outside influence, and we will continue to lead, as we always have." The room filled with quiet applause. She felt it then, the shift in power. It wasn't just about removing Renato from the picture. It was about stepping fully into the role she had once rejected. After the meeting adjourned, Clara approached Bea near the exit. "I wanted to apologize," Clara said quietly, her gaze sincere but nervous. "For everything with Renato, I didn't realize how deep it went." Bea studied her for a long moment. Clara, once the woman who symbolized betrayal, now seemed smaller, less threatening. "It wasn't just you," Bea replied. "Renato made his choices." Clara nodded, swallowing hard. "If you ever need anything—" "I won't," Bea interrupted gently but firmly. Clara's eyes flickered with understanding. She nodded once more and left without another word. Later that evening, Bea stood by the balcony overlooking the city lights below. She thought of Renato not with bitterness, but with a quiet sense of closure. His betrayal had broken something in her, but it had also forged something new. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Alberto entered, his expression warm as he crossed the room to stand beside her. "You handled things well," he said, clasping his hands behind his back. "I wasn't sure if you'd go through with it." "I wasn't sure either," Bea admitted, exhaling softly. "But it needed to happen." Alberto nodded. "And now?" Bea turned to face him fully, the weight of the Vasconcelos legacy no longer a burden, but a gift. "Now, I move forward." Her father smiled approvingly. "Good. It's your time, Bea." As Alberto left, Bea remained on the balcony, the city stretching endlessly before her. It was her time, and she was ready to embrace it. Bea hadn't thought about Renato in weeks, not seriously at least. Since his arrest, life had unfolded in quiet, measured steps. The company thrived under her leadership, and the Vasconcelos name reclaimed its place at the forefront of the industry. Her days were filled with board meetings and expansion plans, while her nights were peaceful for the first time in years. But peace, Bea knew, was fragile. It started with a phone call late one evening. She was leaving the office, the elevator humming softly as it descended to the parking garage. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket, and when she glanced at the screen, her steps slowed. Bea hesitated, her finger hovering over the decline button. But something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps instinct, made her swipe to answer. "Hello?" There was silence at first, followed by a familiar voice that twisted her stomach into knots. "Miss me?" Renato's voice was calm, too calm. Bea's grip on the phone tightened. "You shouldn't be calling me." "You made that clear," he replied, his tone light, but laced with something colder beneath the surface. "But I thought we could catch up. I've had a lot of time to reflect." "I'm sure you have." Bea stepped out of the elevator and crossed the garage quickly, the echo of her heels sharp against the concrete. "I wanted to let you know," Renato continued. "I won't stay down forever. I know you like to think you've won, but I always land on my feet." Bea stopped beside her car, unlocking it with a quick press of her key fob. "What do you want, Renato?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a quiet chuckle. "Nothing right now," he said, "but you'll hear from me again soon." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Bea lowered the phone slowly, her reflection staring back at her from the car window. She slipped inside, locking the doors immediately. Renato's words lingered in the air long after she drove away. Days passed without incident. Bea threw herself into work, refusing to let Renato's voice take up space in her mind. But she couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that he wasn't finished yet. The confirmation came one morning during a board meeting. Alberto had returned from a trip abroad and sat beside her as the executives discussed quarterly reports. Everything was routine until one of the board members shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "There's been a rumor circulating," he said carefully, adjusting his tie, "regarding some irregularities in our overseas accounts." Bea's gaze sharpened. "What kind of irregularities?" The board member hesitated. "It seems someone's been feeding the press. There's speculation about offshore accounts tied to illegal investments." Alberto's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. We vetted every deal." Bea's stomach sank. She already knew where this was coming from. Renato. She kept her face neutral, even as the weight of the room pressed down on her. "Who's behind the leaks?" "We're still investigating," the board member replied, "but it's gaining traction. We need to be proactive." Alberto leaned toward her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "This is him, isn't it?" Bea's jaw tightened. "Yes." Her father exhaled slowly. "I'll handle the board. You handle Renato." That evening, Bea found herself parked outside an old restaurant on the outskirts of town. Renato had texted her hours earlier, requesting a meeting. She could have ignored him, but she didn't. Inside, the restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place where deals were made quietly and secrets rarely left the room. Renato sat in a booth near the back, his expression unreadable as she approached. "You came," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I'm here to end this," Bea replied, sliding into the seat across from him. Renato leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "You're not in a position to end anything, Bea. The press is already circling." "Whatever you've leaked won't stick," she said firmly. "You forget who I am." Renato smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I haven't forgotten, but power isn't as permanent as you think." Bea studied him carefully, searching for the cracks beneath his confident exterior. "You always underestimated me," she said softly. "That's why you'll lose." Renato's eyes darkened. "This isn't over." "It is," Bea said, rising from the table, "and the next time you come for me, you'll regret it." She left without waiting for his response, the weight of his gaze burning into her back as she stepped into the night. Renato might have thought he could drag her down, but Bea wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready for war. Bea stood on the balcony of her father's estate, the cold morning air biting at her skin. The city stretched endlessly before her, but she barely noticed the view. Her mind lingered on Renato's threat, the weight of his words still clinging to her like a shadow. He wasn't done. She knew that, but this time she wouldn't wait for him to strike. Her phone buzzed on the railing beside her. She glanced down, expecting another message from the board or a journalist prying into the rumors. Instead, it was from Alberto. "It's handled. You don't need to worry." Bea exhaled, gripping the phone tightly. She should have felt relieved, but she didn't. Alberto's influence was far-reaching, and she had no doubt he had neutralized whatever damage Renato thought he could cause. But that wasn't enough. Renato wasn't just a problem for her father to fix. He was a reminder of the part of her that had once allowed herself to be betrayed, manipulated, and cast aside. She had let him into her life, let him shape it. And even though he had been removed from the company and her personal life, the scars remained. Bea stared at the city below, her reflection faint in the glass doors behind her. This wasn't about Renato anymore. It was about her. Later that afternoon, Bea returned to the Vasconcelos headquarters. The office hummed with quiet efficiency as employees moved briskly through the hallways. She walked with purpose, heels clicking against the polished marble floors, until she reached the executive wing. She paused outside the door to her office, drawing a steady breath before stepping inside. Clara was waiting for her. Bea's gaze hardened, but she kept her composure. "I wasn't expecting you." Clara rose from the chair, smoothing her coat. "I won't take much of your time. I thought it was better to speak in person." Bea arched a brow, crossing her arms. "Is this about Renato?" Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for Bea to catch it. "I know what he's doing," Clara said carefully, "and I'm not involved in it." "Good for you." Bea's tone was clipped, but not unkind. Clara sighed, shifting her weight. "I didn't come to defend him. I know he's reckless. I wanted to apologize. For everything." Bea studied her, searching for the cracks beneath Clara's polished surface. There was sincerity there, but also something else. Fear. "Renato's dangerous when he feels cornered," Bea said softly. "I don't need your apology. I need you to be smarter." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "I've already distanced myself from him, but I thought you should know. He's trying to gather investors behind your back. He's telling them you aren't fit to lead without your father." Bea's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Let him try." Clara looked as if she wanted to say more, but instead she offered a polite nod and left the office. As the door clicked shut, Bea sat behind her desk, fingers drumming against the polished surface. Renato's games no longer sparked anger in her, they only fueled her resolve. She wasn't the same woman who had once stood quietly in the background of his life. Now, she stood in the center of her own. That evening, Bea attended an investor dinner alongside Alberto. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and the soft hum of classical music. Glasses clinked, and polite conversation filled the air. Renato was there. He stood near the far side of the room, speaking with a small group of investors. When his eyes met Bea's, he smiled, a calculated move, sharp and deliberate. But this time, Bea didn't look away. She walked directly toward him, her posture poised, head held high. The investors around Renato grew quiet as she approached, sensing the tension that crackled between them. "Renato," Bea greeted smoothly, her voice carrying just loud enough for the others to hear. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Renato's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but he recovered quickly. "I've been keeping busy. You know how it is." Bea's gaze flicked to the investors. "I'm sure he's told you all about his recent endeavors. I hope he's mentioned that he's no longer affiliated with Vasconcelos Enterprises." A ripple of surprise passed through the group. Renato's jaw tightened. "Some relationships don't survive betrayal," Bea continued, her eyes never leaving his. "But we learn from them. We grow, and in the end we come out stronger." Renato's mask slipped just enough for her to see the frustration brewing beneath it. Bea smiled faintly, offering a polite nod to the investors. "Enjoy the evening." As she walked away, she felt the weight finally lift from her shoulders. Renato could chase shadows, but he no longer had power over her. Bea had resurrected the woman she was always meant to be. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bea's office, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood. She stood by the window watching the city awaken beneath her, coffee in hand. The sky was clear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, so was her mind. The storm that had once consumed her life had passed. Renato was gone, reduced to whispers in corridors he no longer walked. His attempts to undermine her had failed, leaving him isolated, a remnant of the past that no longer held sway over her future. The phone on her desk buzzed softly, but Bea let it ring. There was no urgency, no lingering dread. Her life was hers again, and she savored the stillness. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Alberto stepped inside, his expression calm yet proud. "You did it," he said simply, as if there had never been any doubt. Bea smiled, the weight of his words settling over her like a warm embrace. "I did." She had not only reclaimed her power, she had redefined it. As she turned back to the window, the city stretched endlessly before her, full of possibilities. This was her new beginning, and this time she would write every chapter on her own terms. If you enjoy these fascinating documentaries about wildlife, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Until next time.